So by way of introduction, I suppose, David, like I said earlier, I'm Gary Loke, the Director of Knowledge, Innovation and Delivery at Advance HE. And this year, Advance HE sponsored the inaugural Times Higher Award for contribution to equality, diversity and inclusion. And I was very pleased as well to be the lead judge in this year's kind of equality, diversity and inclusion category. And it's very nice to have you, David, to have this conversation about, I guess Worcester winning the award. And, first of all, I suppose congratulations to the team at Worcester for winning this award. We're delighted to have sponsored it. And I'm sure it's meant something to you and the university as well. So perhaps you'd like to say a little bit about what it's meant to you and the university to win this kind of inaugural EDI award.
Well, Gary, I'm very pleased to meet you personally by this virtual means. And thank you very much for naming the University of Worcester as the winner of this inaugural award, which is so important for diversity, equality and inclusion. We were absolutely delighted to win this award. Inclusion has been right at the heart of the university's work. Certainly in all the 18 years I've had the privilege of being here. And I know too, in the time of my immediate predecessor, Dorma Irwin, who was a noted feminist and did a great deal to establish a really strong culture of widening participation at the university.
I think one of the things that struck me about the awards this year was about how universities have co-created with their students, how they've co-created their approaches. What part has, I guess, as the student body played in co-creating, your university's approach to equality, diversity, and inclusion?
Well, you put your finger on something very important. At Worcester, we were one of the very first institutions to not only have students on our governing body, which was a lawful requirement, but also to put them onto every committee of the university. And actually, it sometimes comes as a surprise to people, but students now serve, the president of the Students' Union serves on the committee which deals with the Vice-chancellor's remuneration. And I imagine that that's a relatively small number of institutions which have that particular practice. We've also spent a lot of time building a representative network of students, and we've got a student body of just over 10,000. At one point, we had just over 500 student representatives. Currently, we have over 400. And they're very active. They meet regularly. They don't hesitate to bring up ways in which courses can be improved, any shortcomings, changes in the timetable that they think are somehow or other not helpful for students. And of course, they're constantly coming up with propositions which are to do with equality, diversity, and inclusion, just as you would expect. Young people, so many of whom are going on to work in health or in education, but also in the creative professions in business and science. And they come from backgrounds mostly where they're often the first in their family to go to university, where there isn't a lot of money, but there's a lot of talent, a lot of ability, a lot of energy. And we benefit enormously from not just the voice of our students, but also their ideas, their passion, and their energy. So all the achievements of the university are very much co-created.
I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, really, when you talked about, students being part of that co-creation, students being on your governing body, that kind of, and the very, very early adopter of that. And I think the judging panel were particularly struck, I guess, by Worcester's whole institutional approach to equality, diversity, and inclusion, and really, really grounding that in your submission. I suppose from your point of view, what characterizes this approach? Where has it come from? And I guess more importantly, learning for other institutions, how do you sustain that approach and the kind of, in terms of making sure that there is a whole institutional response and approach to EDI?
Well, I suppose that the whole institution approach really has come from, again, in a way, perhaps the teacher training roots. So I'll give a very specific example. In the early 21st century, there was a green paper called Every Child Matters, which was about children progressing generally, particularly those in disadvantaged backgrounds, was concerned with questions of early years education, and how to do our best as a society to make good the disadvantage which children are born into through no fault of their own whatsoever. And this was the one document produced by the government that the university produced a really careful and considered approach to, because this is so important to us as educators of teachers, but also very early into the field of early years education, and the realization that if you want to really help our fellow human beings make the most of their potential, you need to start as young as possible. And at the same time, we were working to develop the idea that every adult who works with children in a school has a role, and that includes people who in the olden days used to be called dinner ladies. It includes perhaps the school secretary or bursar. It includes if they've got anybody working on grounds or maintenance. It includes every adult. Every adult has a responsibility. They have a responsibility not just for safeguarding, but also to help with the education and the development and the socialization of children. And so we became a big educator of not only early years professionals, but also teaching assistants and higher level teaching assistants. And so that approach, as soon as you start thinking like that, you start thinking about a whole institution. And so we started to apply that very actively to ourselves. And I remember we were putting up new halls of residence and designing them in about 2006. And there was a big discussion about how much money we should spend on them, how big the rooms should be, etc. But when we put forward the idea that every room should be big enough for a student who was in a wheelchair, who might have their own personal room on the ground floor in a bigger room than normal because of their impairment. But then if they wanted to visit a fellow student on the 4th floor, they should be able to go up in the lift, be able to go down the corridor under their own steam, go into their friend's room and turn around themselves so that they were enabled as much as possible. And as soon as that argument was put, everybody agreed, yes, we've got to make our halls of residence a bit bigger. And we simply set about raising the money to enable us to be able to do so and to fit it in. And it's been exactly the same with all the sort of doors at the university. I know that in our submission we put in that we won Loo of the Year in 2019. How many vice-chancellors would talk to you about winning Loo of the Year for 2019? But if you have a family member who's really severely impaired, then there's a whole national network of Loos which are really highly inclusive and really help to tackle issues. And we need to have a national network like that. And of course, the university is now one of those places. So we pay attention to all of those details. And I have to say our colleagues in facilities in the university, our colleagues in the organizational and professional side of the university, and our academic colleagues have all just immediately risen to this, as of course have our students. And so, I constantly am getting suggestions about ways of improving things. We just sort of take it for granted that this is the approach that we bring. And we bring the same approach to widened participation, the same approach to gender equity. So when we're thinking about our promotion schemes, of course, we subject them to an annual review for equality impact. And so it's become part of the institutional DNA. I think it was probably there right from the beginning. I think we were lucky to be founded in 1946. But of course, culture is something which is constantly created and recreated. And we do also have a saying at the university, which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's good to have a good strategy, but actually, if you have the right culture, it just puts everything to one side. And that's the culture which we really work hard to adopt. We know we're not an island. We know that there are lots of other things going on. It's a sort of contest. Some people even call it a battle in society, but we're engaged in that. And we're engaged, we like to think, from good values, and we put values very much at the center of the university's strategic plan.
Your telling of that story about the new building, I think I guess resonates a lot with me in the world we find ourselves in terms of the world of COVID, I suppose. One of the things that we've been doing a lot on is working with the Disabled Students Commission, which we provide a secretariat to, but but focusing on thinking about with institutions where not just what their disabled students are doing during engagement times, so things like working with institutions, but what are they not doing when they're not engaged with university. So that whole point of what you want to do is make sure that you have the infrastructure to support a disabled student no matter what they're doing, whether in their room, whether they want to visit a friend, when they're engaging with the university, when they're not engaging with it, and really thinking about that whole student perspective. And I think that's a great great thing to think about, especially in where we've seen the disparity of COVID really draw really come to light in terms of inequality coming through. I guess this win must have been well received by the institution. I mean, what has been the impact really on your staff and student body in kind of telling people that you won this award?
Well, I think a lot of people are very proud that we won this award. They're really delighted. This is a really good award to win. I mean, we also won in 2019 Sustainability Institution of the Year. And people are really proud about that. They're really concerned. They're really concerned for human equality and decency and inclusion and everybody having an opportunity. And they're really concerned that we don't make ourselves extinct as a human race. These are two really big priorities for people. So I think colleagues and students have been absolutely delighted. They've not been surprised either, if I can put it that way, but I think they're proud to be at the university. And they expect it to be like that. And by the way, I think that's been one of the reasons why we've been so relatively successful in negotiating this awful pandemic, which has claimed the lives of so many of our fellow citizens. We have had last term, 58% of our teaching was in person. We haven't had a single outbreak on campus. We work very closely with Public Health Worcestershire. Our case rate compared to the national average of the whole community is 2/3 of the national average, so significantly less. So, and that's all been based on the idea, a very inclusive approach that everybody's an equal citizen. And therefore, of course, our COVID recovery group included student representatives, included staff representatives, including people from the recognized trade unions. And we've just all worked together to pool our resources as best we can and to give it our best shot to try and make the university as safe as possible for people and as inclusive and welcoming as possible for people. And it seems to have really worked and people have behaved well. We don't take this lightly, but I really sincerely believe that this whole institution approach, this equality, inclusive, diverse approach, recognizing that there are differences, but that we are all joined together by being human beings and wanting a better society, really can move mountains and make enormous difficulties disappear. And now we have no statistically significant gender pay gap. That's been years of careful work, but above all, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, it's culture. And the culture produces a wonderful result. And I'm a white man. It's a joy to work here and to work in an institution which doesn't discriminate against people. And if there is something wrong, we're all committed to trying to put it right, because I think that's the other thing. And nobody thinks that we can't learn and we can't do better. So we're constantly trying to think of ways of advancing.
Yeah, I think the culture point you make, David, is so important. And building that institutional culture, is a journey for every institution. I guess thinking about where you've got to, I suppose, in terms of getting this award. I guess my final question really is thinking about the lessons learnt. What kind of tips would you have for institutions who are looking at your win and drawing inspiration from it to say, actually, we want to do something similar. We want this whole institutional approach. We want to build a culture that's like this. What would be your perhaps top 3 tips, if not your top tip? What would you say to them?
Well, I think first of all, people will want to be themselves. And so I think that's important. But I think that's a very good question, Gary. And it immediately makes me think of the late, great Arthur Ashe, the first black person to win a Wimbledon singles title, and who was also a noted campaigner for racial equality. And when he was asked, somebody said, what can I do about racial discrimination? He said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And I think that's such timeless and good advice to people. So the first thing you do is you analyze where you are, so be honest about yourself, do an audit, do an equality audit, find out what the situation is. Don't assume you know what the situation is. Study the facts, and surely that goes right to the heart of being a university institution. It's a scientific approach. So study where you are. So start where you are. Use what you have. I gave an example of a promotion scheme before. Well, that's one way of tackling things. Think of your interview process for new staff. Think of your process for new students. So think of those questions, and then do what you can. And that goes back to the question of the values. Of course, measure your progress. Note when you fall short, and try to keep that bar going. And I think if we all have that approach, we were very proud when we created the University of Worcester Arena, which is the first indoor sports arena in Britain, purpose designed to include the wheelchair athlete. And I remember the coach of the German wheelchair basketball team saying, we have nothing like this in the whole of Germany. You should be very proud for what you've done. And we are proud of it. But actually what we really want to do is to have every sports hall be fully inclusive for wheelchair athletes. And we didn't want to be the only one. I think we've been joined now by the University of Warwick, which is great, but we want our universities generally to be like this and facilities to be inclusive and proper. We see ourselves as part of a movement, and I'm so delighted that Advance HE has decided to sponsor this award, because I think it'll be an inspiration for other people, and I thank you so much.
And thank you, David. I think you're kind of winning the inaugural award, I think, has been an inspiration to other universities as well. So thank you once again for, I guess, putting in your submission, for taking the time to speak today, and congratulations to all of you at Worcester for this kind of fantastic achievement.